What I'm about to tell you is the absolute truth. It's the story of how my quiet life ended and a different one began, all in my 74th year on this earth. The whole thing started over a photograph of a bird that weighed less than a penny. I was standing in the warm, fluorescent glow of the Tubac Community Center, the air thick with the smell of instant coffee and the polite murmurs of my neighbors, when I saw him. He was a specter in the cheerful room, a man whose expensive, tailored suit seemed to suck the light out of the air around him. The photo, my photo, was hanging on a display board, a silver ribbon pinned to the corner. It was a shot of a Lucifer hummingbird, a rare jewel of the Sonoran desert, its gorgeous feathers flashing an impossible magenta. But behind the bird, deep in the out-of-focus background, was the reason he was here. Under the pale light of a gibbous moon, I had accidentally captured a transaction, the ghostly shapes of two trucks, the dark figures of men, and the distinct, rectangular outlines of packages being moved in the dead of night. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My name is Arthur Pendleton. Until that evening, my life was a steady and quiet routine. I was a retired civil engineer, a widower for 6 years, living in a small adobe home that my wife, Helen, and I had built with our own hands. In my previous life, I designed bridges and overpasses, massive concrete and steel structures meant to last for a century. My calculations had to be perfect. A misplaced decimal point, a misread stress analysis, and people could die. I lived a life of precision. Now, in retirement, I applied that same precision to a different art, wildlife photography. I'd spend my days in the desert, silent and still for hours, waiting for the perfect confluence of light, subject, and moment. It was my way of talking to Helen, of showing her that I could still see the beauty she'd always pointed out to me. Our house was a testament to our 45 years together, not just a home, but a living museum of our memories. Her paintings hung on the walls, her pottery sat on the shelves, and my darkroom in the back was filled with thousands of images, a catalog of every bird, every sunset, every season we had shared in this corner of Arizona. After the small award ceremony, as people were milling about, the man in the suit approached me. He was younger than me, perhaps in his late 40s, with smooth, olive skin and eyes as black and empty as a starless night. He introduced himself as Ricardo Vargas. He didn't smile, not with his eyes anyway. His mouth formed the shape of a smile, but it was a cold, practiced gesture. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone with a faint accent I couldn't place. "That is a magnificent photograph. Truly stunning." "Thank you," I said, my guard up for reasons I couldn't yet articulate. "The light was just right." "The light," he repeated, his gaze fixed on the photo. "Yes. Tell me, what do you do with the negatives? The digital files?" It was an odd question. "I archive them, of course. For my collection." "Of course," he mused, finally turning those empty eyes on me. "I am a collector myself. Of rare things. I would like to buy this photograph. And the negative. All the digital copies. I will give you $10,000. I blinked. The prize money had been a $50 gift certificate to the local diner. $10,000 was absurd. It was a good photo, but it wasn't a masterpiece. That's an incredibly generous offer, Mr. Vargas, but I can't sell the negative. It's part of my life's work." His feigned smile evaporated. "I insist. It has a certain personal value to me. Let's say $20,000. Cash. A man your age could use a comfortable cushion." The words were polite, but the tone was not. It was the sound of a closing door. "No," I said, my voice firmer now. "The answer is no. It's not for sale." He stared at me for a long moment, a flicker of something truly ugly passing through his eyes. It was a look of profound annoyance, the way a man might look at a stubborn insect just before crushing it. "A pity," he said softly, then turned and walked away without another word, melting back into the crowd and out the door. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. I packed up my gear, collected my photo, and drove home, the strange encounter replaying in my mind. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself he was just some eccentric rich man. I put the photo on my mantelpiece, made a cup of chamomile tea, and sat in my old leather armchair, the one Helen always said was molded perfectly to my shape. I drifted off to sleep there, as I often did. I awoke to the smell of smoke. Not the gentle, fragrant smoke of a mesquite fire in the hearth, but the acrid, chemical stench of something burning that shouldn't be. My lungs seized. The air was thick and gray. Panic, cold and sharp, jolted me awake. The curtains in the living room were engulfed in roaring orange flames. The fire was everywhere, consuming the wooden beams, the Navajo rugs, Helen's paintings curling into black ash. I stumbled through the inferno, my mind screaming a single, silent word, darkroom. My negatives. My work. My memories. I reached the back of the house, but a wall of flame erupted from the doorway, throwing me back. The heat was immense, a physical blow. The ceiling groaned above me. I knew I had seconds. With a sob of pure anguish, I abandoned the thought of saving anything and scrambled for the front door, my pajamas singed, my skin blistering. I fell out onto the gravel driveway, gasping for air, and watched as the roof of my life collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks into the indifferent desert night. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was a pair of headlights, far down my long driveway, turning onto the main road and speeding away without slowing down. I woke up in a hospital bed in Nogales. A nurse told me I was lucky. A neighbor had seen the glow from a mile away and called it in. Severe smoke inhalation, second-degree burns on my arms and back. But I would live. My home, my cameras, my darkroom, my negatives, everything was gone. 45 years of memories turned to ash and smoke. The next day, a local sheriff's deputy, a young man with a bored expression, came to take my statement. I told him everything, about the photo, about Ricardo Vargas, about the absurd offer and the veiled threat. He wrote it down in a little notepad, his pen scratching with agonizing slowness. "Vargas, you say?" he asked, not looking at me. "Prominent businessman. Owns a big logistics company. Donates a lot to the community. You sure you got the name right?" "I'm sure," I rasped, my throat raw. He was interested in the background of the photo. "The trucks." "Sir, the fire marshal's preliminary report says it was likely faulty wiring in your kitchen. An old house like that, it happens." "That's not possible," I insisted. "I rewired that whole house myself 10 years ago. It was arson. It was him." The deputy sighed, a long, weary sound of someone who had already made up his mind. He closed his notepad. "We'll look into it, Mr. Pendleton. You just focus on getting better." Later that afternoon, lying in the sterile silence of my room, I overheard 2 nurses talking at the station just outside my door. Their voices were low, but the door was ajar. The old man in room 3, the fire out in Tubac. "Oh, yeah, the one who lost everything? So sad. Sheriff Brolin was just on the phone with the chief. Said the old guy is confused, making up stories about some local big shot. They're closing the case. Accidental electrical fire." The words hit me harder than the fire itself. Confused. Making up stories. They weren't going to do anything. There would be no investigation. No justice. In their eyes, I was just a senile old man whose house had burned down. I was nothing. A loose end that had been neatly tied up. I closed my eyes, the smell of antiseptic failing to mask the phantom stench of smoke that I knew would never leave me. In that moment, lying in a hospital bed with nothing to my name but a thin gown, I understood I was completely and utterly alone. And a cold, hard resolve began to form in the ruins of my heart. It was the same kind of resolve I used to feel when staring at a complex engineering problem. They had created a problem. And I, Arthur Pendleton, would design the solution. They discharged me 2 days later with a handful of prescriptions and a brochure for a homeless shelter. I was a ghost in my own life. I used the last bit of cash I had in my wallet to get a room at a grimy motel off the interstate, the kind of place where the Gideon's Bible is the cleanest thing in the room. For days, I just sat there, the television murmuring nonsense as I stared at the stuccoed walls, the burns on my arms a constant, throbbing reminder of what I had lost. Grief was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. But beneath the grief, the cold, hard knot of resolve was tightening. They thought they had erased me. They were wrong. They had simply cleared the board for a new game. My first move was to visit the public library. I looked like a vagrant, my clothes rumpled and smelling of antiseptic, my hair still flecked with ash. But the librarian was kind. She helped me log onto a computer, my bandaged fingers fumbling with the keyboard. The photography competition had an online gallery. I prayed they had uploaded the high-resolution images. They had. I found my photo, the silver ribbon now a cruel joke. I clicked on it and zoomed in, pushing the magnification to its pixelated limit. There, in the grainy darkness behind the Hummingbird, was the background Mr. Vargas had been so eager to acquire. One of the trucks was a large semi-trailer. On its side, faint but unmistakable, was a logo, a stylized scorpion, its tail forming the letter V. Below it, I could just make out the words, Vargas Logistics. The sheriff had mentioned the name. A legitimate company. A perfect front. I spent the next week living in that library, from the moment it opened to the moment it closed. I was no longer a photographer. I was an engineer again, but this time, I wasn't studying blueprints for bridges, I was studying the architecture of a criminal enterprise. I fell down a rabbit hole of online articles, forums, and archives. I learned about the Sonora Cartel, a notoriously violent organization that controlled smuggling routes from Mexico into Arizona. I read about their brutal methods, their infiltration of local businesses, their corruption of law enforcement. And I learned about their new head of operations in the region, a man known for his business acumen and utter ruthlessness. His nickname, whispered in DEA bulletins and Border Patrol forums, was El Scorpion. The Scorpion. Ricardo Vargas. My research painted a chilling picture. Vargas Logistics wasn't just a front, it was the entire circulatory system of their operation. They moved drugs, weapons, and cash disguised as legitimate cargo, avocados, electronics, machine parts. They were sophisticated. They didn't just rely on violence, they relied on infrastructure. On logistics. On precision. It was a language I understood. They had built a complex, efficient machine of corruption and death. And like any machine, it had stress points. It had vulnerabilities. It had critical components that, if removed, would cause the entire structure to fail. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. I was one old man with a library card against a multi-million-dollar international crime syndicate. Direct confrontation was suicide. The local police were compromised. Federal agencies were too big and slow. By the time they listened to an anonymous tip from a crazy old man, I'd be buried in a shallow grave in the desert. I needed a different kind of weapon. I needed knowledge. I needed an ally who understood the world I was about to step into. My mind drifted back decades, to a different life, a different continent. In the late 1970s, I'd taken a leave from my firm to work on a government contract in South America. The official project was a hydroelectric dam in a remote, politically unstable region. The unofficial project, which I only slowly came to understand, was to create infrastructure that could be used for covert operations by the CIA. It was a world of coded language, of dual-purpose designs, of men who existed in the shadows. I was just the engineer, the nuts and bolts guy, but I worked alongside an analyst, a quiet, brilliant man named Frank Mercer. We were both logistics men, obsessed with systems and how they worked. We developed a kind of shorthand, a language built on engineering terms and project code names. After the project ended, we'd lost touch. That was over 40 years ago. Frank would be my age now, maybe older. If he was even still alive. It was the longest of long shots, a desperate prayer. I found a small, obscure online forum for retired federal employees. It was mostly men swapping war stories and complaining about their pensions. I created an anonymous account and posted a single, cryptic message in the general discussion board. It was a message that would mean nothing to 99.9% of the people who saw it. But to Frank, if he was out there, it would be a flare in the dark. I wrote, "Inquiry for former personnel on Project Tequila. Having trouble with unexpected sediment flow downstream of spillway B, seeking consultation on structural resonance." I clicked post and stared at the screen. It was done. I had cast a message in a bottle into the vast, digital ocean. Now, all I could do was wait and see if a ghost from the past would answer. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. They knew I was alive. They knew I had lost everything. They didn't see me as a threat, but as a loose thread, something to be monitored until it unraveled on its own. It was a display of their power, their absolute control over my new, pathetic existence. Vargas Logistics trucks, with that scorpion logo, seemed to be everywhere. One would suddenly appear behind my old, sputtering pickup truck on a lonely stretch of road, its massive grille filling my entire rearview mirror, staying there for miles before abruptly turning off. It was a constant, silent reminder, we are here. We see you. One afternoon, I was at a small cafe, nursing a single cup of coffee for hours, trying to make my meager funds last. A man sat down at the table next to me. He was big, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they could crush stone. He didn't order anything. He just sat there, cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife, and stared at me. He never said a word. After 20 minutes, he got up and left. The message was clear. I had no sanctuary. There was no corner of this small town where I could hide. The apex of this casual cruelty came when I saw Ricardo Vargas himself. He was having lunch at the Goods, the nicest restaurant in Tubac, a place Helen and I used to go for our anniversary. He was sitting on the patio, laughing with two other men. One of them was Sheriff Brolin, the same man whose department had dismissed my case as an electrical accident. Brolin was laughing, his face ready with wine and good humor, as Vargas, a man who had burned my life to the ground, picked up the check. Seeing them together, so comfortable, so untouchable, solidified the poison of helplessness in my veins. My enemy wasn't just a man, he was a pillar of the community. He bought and sold the law like he bought and sold avocados. How could I possibly fight that? I was a 74-year-old man, living out of a motel, with $5 to my name. It was the lowest point of my life. I felt the full weight of my age, my poverty, my utter insignificance. They had already won. I returned to my motel room that night, a profound and heavy despair settling over me. I thought about giving up, about just getting in my truck and driving until I ran out of gas, disappearing into the anonymity of the American landscape. I logged onto the library computer one last time, a final, futile check of the forum. My heart hammered against my ribs when I saw a notification. I had a private message. The sender's name was just an alphanumeric string. I clicked it open. The message contained only 5 words. Spillway B, stand by. Acknowledge. Tears welled in my eyes. It was him. It was Frank. Spillway B was our old code for a compromised situation that required a non-standard solution. Stand by meant he was activating old protocols. Acknowledge was an order. After 40 years of silence, a ghost had answered. I typed back a single word, my fingers shaking with a feeling that was 1 part relief and 3 parts terror. Acknowledged. The next message came an hour later, with instructions for installing an encrypted messaging program. The game had changed. I was no longer alone. Frank's first message on the secure channel was blunt. Arthur. I'm sorry about your wife. I heard she passed. And I'm sorry about your house. I ran your name through some old channels when you didn't respond to the alumni newsletter. Knew you were in Arizona. When I saw your post, I put 2 and 2 together. Tell me everything. So I did. I poured out the whole story, the photo, Vargas, the fire, the corrupt sheriff, the intimidation. It was a relief to tell someone who wouldn't think I was senile. Frank listened, his text-based responses brief and analytical. He was still the same old Frank, a man who saw the world as a series of interlocking systems. When I was finished, he wrote, "Okay. This is a logistics problem. Nothing more. These cartel people, they think they're warriors. They're not. They're glorified shipping clerks with guns. They have supply chains, distribution networks, and payroll. They have infrastructure. And you and I, Arthur, are very, very good at infrastructure." A fire I thought had been extinguished forever rekindled in my chest. He was right. I had spent my entire life designing, building, and maintaining complex systems. That was my gift. My curse was that I only saw the good in it. Frank saw the other side. "You cannot fight them head-on," he wrote. "A frontal assault is suicide. They have more money and more men. Amateurs attack the muscle. Professionals attack the infrastructure. We are going to dismantle them, piece by piece, from the inside out. We will be ghosts. They will never see us coming." That was the moment everything shifted. The grief, the fear, the despair, it didn't disappear, but it crystallized. It transformed from a paralyzing weight into a fuel source. This was no longer just about revenge for a lost life. It was about a final project. A final design. I would apply a lifetime of knowledge, of precision, of methodical planning, to a single task, the complete and utter deconstruction of the Vargas cartel's Arizona operation. I felt a sense of purpose that I thought had been buried with Helen. I went to the small, cracked mirror in the motel bathroom and looked at my reflection. I saw an old man, gaunt and tired, with burns on his arms and sorrow in his eyes. But for the first time in a long time, I also saw an engineer with a job to do. Our first step was reconnaissance. We needed a complete blueprint of Vargas's operation. Frank, it turned out, hadn't spent his retirement playing shuffleboard. He was a prolific gray hat hacker, a digital phantom who surfed the dark web for sport and kept his skills sharp by probing the defenses of corporate and government servers. He was a digital ghost with access to satellite imagery archives, public record databases, and a network of other retired spooks who traded favors like baseball cards. While Frank worked the digital angles, my job was the physical world. I became a creature of observation. I bought a new wardrobe from a thrift store, the bland, invisible uniform of an elderly man. Tan slacks, a faded polo shirt, a baseball cap. I spent my days sitting on park benches, at bus stops, and cheap diners. I watched the Vargas logistics trucks. I noted their routes, their schedules, the times they passed certain checkpoints. I became an expert in their patterns. I followed their drivers at a distance, learning where they ate, where they lived. I was just a harmless old man, reading a newspaper. No one ever looked at me twice. Combining my on-the-ground observations with Frank's digital deep dives, we began to build a schematic of their machine. We mapped their supply chain from the border crossing at Nogales, through a series of small, anonymous-looking warehouses, to distribution points in Tucson and Phoenix. We identified the shell corporations used for money laundering, a chain of car washes, a string of convenience stores, a produce import-export business. Every piece of the puzzle we uncovered was a victory, a small spark of light in the darkness. Frank's research confirmed that Sheriff Brolin was on Vargas's payroll, receiving monthly payments through one of the shell corporations. He owned the law. But he didn't own the entire system. He was just one component. The real breakthrough came after 3 weeks of painstaking work. Frank had been analyzing property tax records and utility usage reports for dozens of commercial properties in Santa Cruz County. He found an anomaly. A large, nondescript warehouse on the industrial outskirts of Nogales, owned by a shell corporation that we had linked to Vargas, was consuming an enormous amount of electricity, far more than a typical storage facility. But it wasn't just the amount, it was the pattern. Massive spikes in usage between 2 and 4 a.m., several nights a week. "That's not storage, Arthur," Frank's message read. "That's production, or at the very least, repackaging and distribution. The power signature is all wrong for a simple depot." I drove down there the next day. The warehouse was exactly as he described, anonymous, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Security cameras were everywhere. It looked formidable. But as I sat in my truck a half-mile away, watching through a pair of binoculars, I saw the flaw. It was a fortress designed to repel a physical assault. The guards were armed, the gates were reinforced. They were prepared for the DEA to come kicking in the door. But they weren't prepared for an engineer. The building itself was an off-the-shelf industrial structure. Its defenses were superficial. Its true weakness was the system it was a part of. We had found it. We had found the heart of the machine. It was time to start taking it apart. Our war began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a series of anonymous tips from a dozen different burner phones, sent to a dozen different agencies. It was a campaign of 1,000 paper cuts, each one designed to bleed the Vargas operation slowly, to introduce friction into their perfectly calibrated machine. Frank called it weaponized bureaucracy. Phase 1 was to attack the logistics. As an engineer who had designed interstate highways, I knew the labyrinthine world of the Department of Transportation and its regulations better than most. I knew the schedules for the mobile way stations, the specific safety protocols that were most often ignored, and which violations triggered the most time-consuming inspections. We started with the trucks. A tip to the DOT hotline from a concerned citizen about Vargas Logistics trucks running overweight on I-19. Another tip to the Arizona Highway Patrol about their drivers falsifying their logbooks. We timed the tips to hit when their trucks were on a tight schedule, carrying perishable goods, the avocados they used to mask the smell of their other cargo. Suddenly, Vargas's trucks were being pulled over for random inspections. A 15-minute stop would turn into a 3-hour ordeal as officers meticulously checked tire pressure, brake lines, and shipping manifests. Shipments were delayed. Deadlines were missed. Clients got angry. The avocados started to rot. It was chaos, but a subtle chaos. To Vargas, it just looked like a string of unbelievable bad luck. Phase 2 was to attack the money. Frank traced the flow of their laundered cash to a chain of 6 car washes in Tucson. They were all cash businesses, perfect for washing dirty money clean. A direct accusation of money laundering would be ignored without a mountain of proof. But tax evasion? That was a different story. I spent a week sitting in my truck across the street from their busiest location, counting every single car that went through and noting the services they purchased. I compared my numbers to the quarterly earnings reports their shell corporation filed with the state. The discrepancy was enormous. They were declaring less than a third of their actual income. Another anonymous tip, this time to the IRS. Not a dramatic letter about a drug cartel, but a dry, meticulously detailed report from a disgruntled former employee, complete with spreadsheets and time-stamped observations, alleging massive payroll and income tax fraud. The IRS loves low-hanging fruit. Within a month, all 6 car washes were being audited. Their accounts were frozen. The flow of clean money back into the operation was choked to a trickle. The pressure was building. We could feel it. Frank, monitoring chatter on the dark web, picked up whispers of concern from Vargas's superiors in Mexico. Their Arizona operation was becoming unreliable, inefficient. Shipments were late, and money was tight. This brought us to Phase 3, sow internal distrust. We knew from our research that the only thing a cartel fears more than the law is betrayal from within. Vargas had a second-in-command, a brutish enforcer named Hector. He was ambitious and, according to Frank's sources, felt he was underappreciated. Hector was our target. We crafted the perfect message. It was a text, sent from a spoof number to one of the cartel's known lieutenants in Sonora. It was simple, elegant, and devastating. It read, El Escorpion blames bad luck for the delays. Ask him about the new house he is building in Scottsdale. He is getting comfortable. The system is breaking. The detail about the house was a stroke of genius on Frank's part. He'd found the building permits filed under the name of Vargas's sister-in-law. It was a piece of information only a trusted insider, or a very thorough ghost, could know. We sent the message and waited. The seed was planted. We knew that in their world of violent paranoia, a seed like that would grow into a forest of suspicion overnight. The fallout was almost immediate. Frank's sources reported that Vargas was being questioned by his superiors. He had to explain the bad luck. He had to justify the frozen accounts. Unable to find the real source of his problems, he did what men like him always do: he turned on his own people. He started to believe there was a traitor in his organization. Hector, the ambitious number 2, was his prime suspect. The command structure began to fracture under the weight of paranoia. Men were questioned, beaten. The smooth, efficient machine we had targeted was now sputtering, its gears grinding against each other. Vargas was distracted, enraged, and bleeding money. He was off balance. And that's when we decided it was time to strike at the heart. It was time to go after the warehouse. The final act was not about destruction, but about exposure. The warehouse in Nogales was the nexus of Vargas's entire U.S. operation. Taking it down wouldn't just cripple him, it would decapitate him. Frank and I had studied the blueprints, the zoning laws, the inspection histories. The building itself was our weapon. Men like Vargas, so focused on external threats like cops and rival gangs, often overlooked the mundane dangers of building codes and federal regulations. First, I discovered a series of minor but significant fire code violations. They were using improper wiring for their industrial refrigeration units and blocking several emergency exits with pallets of illicit goods. A simple, anonymous complaint to the Nogales fire marshal, framed as a concern from a neighboring business, was enough to put them on the inspection schedule. Second, Frank unearthed a gem in the EPA database. The property was zoned for dry goods storage, but our analysis of their supply chain showed they were moving precursor chemicals for methamphetamine production. The site was long overdue for a mandatory EPA hazardous materials audit, an inspection Vargas had always managed to postpone with a generous donation to the right local official. Another tip, this time to a notoriously ambitious field agent at the federal EPA office in Tucson, highlighting a potential for toxic runoff into a nearby watershed. We made it sound urgent and politically sensitive. A federal agent from Tucson wouldn't be swayed by a bribe from a Nogales sheriff. The final piece was technological. I needed to blind them at the critical moment. I went on the internet and, for $80, purchased a simple, low-power GPS jammer. It was marketed to truckers who wanted to block their dispatchers from tracking them. To me, it was a surgical tool. The night before the planned inspections, I dressed in the coveralls of a utility worker, complete with a hard hat and a tool belt. I drove a beat-up work van I'd bought for cash. Under the cover of darkness, I approached a utility pole about 200 yards from the warehouse. I shimmied up, my old muscles screaming in protest, and strapped the small, black box to the pole, hidden behind a transformer. I activated it with a simple remote. It was just powerful enough to disrupt the GPS signals and high-frequency transmissions used by their security cameras and communication systems, but not strong enough to attract widespread attention. To them, it would seem like a temporary, inexplicable technical glitch. The next morning, I was miles away, parked at a scenic overlook in the Patagonia Mountains, a place Helen and I used to love. I had a pair of powerful binoculars and a police scanner. Frank was my eyes and ears in the digital world, monitoring everything remotely from his home in Florida. At 10 a.m., the fire marshal's truck arrived, as scheduled. The guards at the gate, flustered and confused, had no choice but to let him in. They couldn't exactly shoot a fire inspector. 10 minutes later, as the fire marshal was inside, pointing out violations, 2 blue sedans from the EPA rolled up. The federal agents. Their arrival, unannounced, caused more confusion. Their communications were down, they couldn't get a clear signal to call Vargas or their lawyers. And that was the beauty of the plan. It wasn't a raid. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. One set of officials found blocked exits. The other set, armed with a federal warrant, demanded access to the chemical storage areas. The warehouse manager, a man used to dealing with threats he could intimidate or shoot, was completely out of his depth. He was faced with men and women armed with clipboards and the full weight of the United States government. He had no protocol for this. He made a fatal mistake. He denied the EPA agents access to a locked section of the warehouse. That was all the probable cause they needed. Within an hour, a federal judge had signed a no-knock warrant for the entire premises, and this time, the agents who arrived were wearing tactical gear and carrying rifles. I listened on the scanner as the controlled chaos unfolded. We have a false wall on the north side, requesting backup. Subjects are non-compliant. Jackpot. It's the motherlode. They had found it all. The drugs, the cash, the weapons, the chemicals. Everything. The heart of the machine had been laid bare, not by a heroic gunfight, but by a fire code violation and an overdue environmental audit. As DEA and FBI vehicles swarmed the location, effectively dismantling Ricardo Vargas's entire empire in a single, anticlimactic afternoon, I put down my binoculars. My work was done. A cactus wren landed on a branch nearby, its cheerful, chattering call echoing in the quiet desert air. I picked up my camera, my hands perfectly steady, and took its picture. The aftermath was swift and total. The evidence seized from the warehouse was overwhelming. Ricardo "El Scorpion" Vargas was arrested that evening at his Scottsdale construction site, his face a mask of disbelief as federal agents put him in cuffs. The story dominated the local news, a brilliant federal operation that had taken down a major cartel kingpin. My name, of course, was never mentioned. I was just the anonymous informant, the ghost in the machine. With their logistics in ruins and the trust of their superiors shattered, the Sonora Cartel did what all such organizations do: they cut their losses. They erased him. Sheriff Brolin was implicated in the subsequent investigation and forced to resign in disgrace, facing federal corruption charges. The entire local network Vargas had so carefully built collapsed like a house of cards. Using the substantial reward money from the federal government, funneled to me through a lawyer Frank had arranged, I bought my old plot of land back. I hired a contractor and built a new house, small and simple, but this time, I made it fireproof, with stone floors and a steel roof. I built a new darkroom in the back, better than the old one. A few months later, I read a small article in the back pages of the Arizona Daily Star. Ricardo Vargas, who had been denied bail and was awaiting trial in a federal penitentiary, had been found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide. I knew better. The cartel had its own way of tying up loose ends. It was a cold, efficient business decision. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse. Just a quiet, profound sense of finality. An engineering problem had been solved. I am back in my darkroom now. The faint, chemical smell of fixer fills the air, a scent I have always found comforting. I am standing over a developing tray, watching an image slowly emerge from the blank white paper. It's a photograph I took this morning, out in the desert. A perfect, crystal-clear shot of a Lucifer hummingbird, its wings a frozen blur, its gorget catching the morning light in a blaze of magenta. It is a thing of beauty, a moment of impossible grace captured forever. The fight is over. The silence Helen loved has returned. I am at peace. They thought because I was old, I was finished with building things. They never considered I might be just as good at taking them apart. The end.